Elder fraud is a very real scary thing. Senior citizens, that is, people over the age of 60, are among the most vulnerable in the society. They are pensioners, they have retirement funds, they have savings, maybe a bit of property to their name as well, a car and a house or apartment. They have medical ailments and mobility issues. And in the Western world and in countries like Japan or even Pakistan, where children have settled abroad, they usually live alone or employ a caretaker and are susceptible to scams designed to impoverish them of their hard-earned money and ownership. Scams that work on them can be tried on young people too. A con is a con, a pyramid scheme is a pyramid scheme, and online or by mail fraud is a fraud. The U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigations says this about elder fraud on its site, quote, "Each year, millions of elderly Americans fall victim to some type of financial fraud or confidence scheme, including romance, lottery, and sweepstakes scams, just to name a few. Criminals will gain their targets' trust and may communicate with them directly online, over the phone, and or through the mail, or indirectly through the TV and radio. Once successful, scammers often keep a scheme going because of the prospect of significant financial gain. Seniors are often targeted because they tend to be trusting and polite. They also usually have financial savings, own a home, and have good credit, all of which make them attractive to scammers. Additionally, seniors may be less inclined to report fraud because they don't know how, or they may be too ashamed at having been scammed. They might also be concerned that their relatives will lose confidence in their abilities to manage their own financial affairs. And when an elderly victim does report a crime, they may be unable to supply detailed information to investigators. With the elderly population growing and seniors racking up more than $3 billion in losses annually, elder fraud has remained a growing problem." Unquote. Of course, this particular page also contains the common elder fraud schemes that are employed by the scammers and how the elder citizens can protect themselves and how they can report. Even if you don't live in America, I think that the tips given on this webpage are useful for all of us. Now, this criminal activity and its aftermath is at the very heart of Guilt, Keigo Higashino's latest non-Kaga and non-detective Galileo mystery. The English translation has been done by Giles Murray. It was originally published in Japan in 2024 as Hakuchu to Komori, Bats and Swans, by Gentosha Bunko. I love Keigo and his ability to talk about Japanese culture, norms, food, societal ills, and history in a hard-nosed, step-by-step police procedural murder mystery. The detectives here, both Godai and Nakamachi, are as dry as Kaga. They are not flamboyant like Galileo. And their work is as slow and dull as that of real law enforcement officers. But the story has a heart and a lot of curiously ill-placed emotion. Kensuke Shiraishi, the dead man whose murder starts the investigation in 2017, is not a bad person. Far from it. He is the most likable character in the book. Tatsuro Kuraki, his alleged killer, who makes a full confession to the police, is not a bad person either. He is also not the killer. In case you think this is a spoiler, it's not, because the confession occurs very soon at 15% mark, chapter 9, with following chapter explaining in detail why and how he did it. And of course he lies. He didn't do it. As per the general wisdom, he is hiding the identity of the real killer for sentimental reasons. That he is also dying of colorectal cancer, revealed in chapter 41 at 76% mark, is something that you can guess from a mile away. Well, not the cancer, but the fact that he must be dying, and that's why he has made a false confession, because he knows that he doesn't have much time anyways. The third piece of the puzzle, Junji Fukuma, is not a bad person either. He's the guy who had the misfortune of being arrested for a crime he didn't commit, and who later on died in police custody. These men, their wives, and their children are all good, decent people. They are all hard-working people. So how come all these families get destroyed? The root of what happens today is found 30 years ago in the life and murder of a certain Shozo Heitani, a former insurance company salesman who gave consumer information to scammers and helped them gain trust of potential clients, aka victims. His modus operandi is given in detail in Chapter 8 at 12 to 13% mark as follows. Now, this is a conversation that the two detectives are having with the original lead investigator for the Heitani murder case 30 years ago. I'm reading the passage from the book. Quote, "The East-West Trading Company incident. I vaguely remember studying it at the police academy. Large-scale fraud, wasn't it? They got their customers to buy gold, told them it was an asset that could only go up in value. Nothing wrong with that. The only problem was they wouldn't actually hand over the physical gold to their customers, and instead they issued them pieces of paper, which they had the balls to refer to as securities. They insisted they would keep the physical gold safe on the company's premises. That wasn't the case. The company never purchased the bullion in the first place. They just helped themselves to the money they got from their customers. Plenty of people, many of them on the elderly side, were taken in. Of course, it's not the sort of scam you can sustain indefinitely. As more and more people started making official complaints, the company's dirty tricks were eventually laid bare. The company collapsed, and whatever assets remained were returned to the victims. The sums were pitifully small, though." After having delivered this speech, Muramatsu took a sip of tea. Was there a link between the two cases? That is, the murder of Heitani and the fraud scheme. An indirect one. Like I said, East-West trading itself collapsed, but plenty of people from the firm, both the executives and ordinary employees, launched new scams of their own. Scams involving golf club memberships, palladium futures trading, getting people to buy worthless precious stones at inflated prices. They would do anything to trick their customers out of their money. It would always end with the scammer doing a runner or the company going into planned bankruptcy. They liked to target old people who lived alone. They would call people indiscriminately until they found someone old who lived alone. Then they'd deploy every trick in the book to scam them. They would tell them lies, like, your pension will be automatically cut if you have too much money sitting in your bank account, so you're better off investing your savings with us. They were all scumbags, but Shozo Heitani, the victim, was a real hyena. Godai leaned forward slightly. They seemed to have finally come to the link with the Higashi Okazaki case. These fraudsters were always on the lookout for marks. Heitani got to know them and started introducing them to people he thought they'd be able to scam. He had previously worked at a life insurance company and he got the names from customer lists he had stolen when he quit. He had information on people's ages, incomes, savings, sometimes even the makeup of their families. For anyone who was planning on committing any kind of fraud, he was a great guy to know. Heitani would take the salesmen of these dodgy outfits with him to the house of whichever old person they had decided to target. He would introduce them, pretending it was part of the follow-up service for life insurance products the old folks had already purchased from his former employer. Believing that there was a connection to insurance they already held made them that much easier to trick. And apparently, this Heitani fellow had the gift of gab. Sometimes he would even bring along small presents. The lonely old folks were completely disarmed and treated him like a member of the family. I can see why someone would want to stab him. Quite. The main thrust of our investigation was to speak to Heitani's victims. When we started looking into it, we discovered that at the time of the murder, the proportion of people who realized they had been tricked by him was surprisingly low. I heard there was even one old woman who, when she heard he was dead, burst into tears and was like, "How could such a terrible thing happen to such a nice young man?" Unquote. I liked the book and the characters, even though the story is not as exciting or gripping as Keigo Higashino's other work. And I also think that Keigo played it safe in coming up with the killer of Kensuke Shiraishi and the killer's reasons for committing the crime. The psychology behind the motive is nothing new, so the revelation is underwhelming. Thanks to the publisher Minotaur Books for the ARC of the first edition published in US 2026.